So here's the starting premise. It seems highly likely, if not unavoidable, that we will be passing on so-called high-level nuclear waste to one or many remote future forms of life. Let me run through some data on high-level nuclear waste with you, as documented by various international nuclear regulatory bodies. Of the different sorts of nuclear waste that there are, so-called high-level nuclear waste generates both a great deal of heat and extreme levels of radioactivity, and remains in that state for somewhere between tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, and some of it for millions of years. This kind of waste, high-level nuclear waste, covers plutonium-239 with a half-life of 24,000 years, technetium-99 with a half-life of 220,000 years, and iodine-129 with a half-life of 15.7 million years. On current estimates, the extant volume of nuclear waste in our world, or high-level nuclear waste in our world, is certainly not negligible. Worldwide production of it is estimated at between 1 to 3% of the total volume of all nuclear waste. So high-level nuclear waste is just one kind of nuclear waste that we have in our world today. It's only 1 to 3% of that waste, but still its amount, given that percentage, is staggering. Worldwide, the total amount of high-level nuclear waste produced over the past 60 years or so is at about 400,000 metric tons, of which perhaps a third has either been reprocessed or made more or less inert through a process called vitrification. Also on a global level, around 11,000 metric tons of this high-level nuclear waste is produced per year, and this is expected to increase in the coming decade as aging or politically unsupportable nuclear plants, such as in Lithuania, around the world are decommissioned. In terms of the handling of such waste, current nuclear fuel recycling capacity, not output, but just very optimistically capacity, is estimated at 2,000 metric tons per year. Plans are also weighed to bury such waste, such as at Finland's so-called Onkalo burial site. At an estimated cost of 4 billion euros, or maybe more, it will, upon completion, hold somewhere around 5,500 to 6,500 metric tons of waste. If we extrapolate from those figures in light of extant volumes of high-level nuclear waste, we would need between 40 to 60 Onkalo-like sites to be built, plus at least 2 or more per year to accommodate the further ongoing production of high-level nuclear waste. Finally, the science around the long-term storage of the waste in such burial facilities, for instance, concerning the interaction of the waste with its storage materials and with microbes, soils, waters, is an evolving field, to say the least. From a philosophical point of view, high-level nuclear waste is noteworthy for the manner in which it upends typical ways of thinking about future-directed or deep future-directed ethics. That is, there are certain frameworks that we have that are popular today for thinking about how we as a collective or a species have to act with respect to future generations. What I want to say to you is that those diverse and very interesting discussions ill prepare us for another question, namely how we as a society or a species have to act with respect to future generations concerning high-level nuclear waste. Let me try to elaborate that a bit here. If I'm supposing that there are two questions here that are different, then in what respects are they different? Here's one way to understand that difference. Oftentimes, when philosophers ask about how to act ethically towards some future forms of life, a popular move is to frame this as a matter of bequeathing some X to the future. The X might count for many things. It might be the earth or nature or the wild, wilderness, fauna and flora and its diversity. It might be our human, cultural, spiritual and historical legacy and all of its richness, or its deplorability. Maybe we also need to preserve the Holocaust in some sense. It might be natural resources like wood, air, water, rare earth metals, tuna, truffles. It might be monies, capital, liquidities. It might be more abstractly sense quantifiable productive opportunities, or something more abstract still, such as our practices, cultures, and traditions, how we educate, how we teach others or learn ourselves to live in relation to one's environment. The crucial underlying supposition in that bequeathal framework, determining both what is to be done for the future and why, is quite important. Namely, that if we do not bequeath, or we do not properly bequeath some X will be denied to one or some futures, which may seriously affect how they will pursue their lives. That is, the future's access to or disposing of that X does not go without saying. The present or coming future, more or less remote, represents a threat to the continued existence, if not the value, of that X. For instance, because of our mining, industrial, or military activities, or because museums or other cultural institutions become defunded, or because of our wastefulness and inefficiencies. Working to bequeath those entities or capabilities, or enhancing them through our bequeathing, would be a way to combat that threat, so that those in the future will be able to partake of the value of that X, as we and perhaps others before us have. So on the back of this sketch of thinking about how we act ethically towards the future, towards future generations, I want to highlight two evaluative aspects of such quote-unquote intergenerational bequeathal. Roughly the manner that some valuings and values are involved in the what and the how of bequeathal. The first you could think of as concerning what I'm going to call the role of electivity in bequeathal, and the second concerns what I want to call the evaluative integration that must accompany and condition any such bequeathal. The first aspect, electivity, has to do with what some might refer to as the composition of our bequest package for the future. Electivity, as I want to propose it, is not about determining or constructing the value of some X to be bequeathed. Borrowing from some crotchety old German philosophers, it is rather about how there is built into our bequeathal an evaluative scale of some X's to be bequeathed, a quote-unquote ladder of values in which those X's are arranged. This ladder of values is reflected in those things that are a part of our bequeathing. Let me elaborate. Some entities that are part of our world may seem to have intrinsic aesthetic value, for instance, the cultural landmark that is Venice or Bangkok, Lisbon or Vilnius, or they might be seen to have infungible extrinsic value, clean air, clean water, or they might be seen to have both, for instance, certain kinds of ecosystems like the glacier or the rainforest. And not all of such valued entities or states of value may need to be part of a concerted effort on our parts to bequeath. Perhaps future generations will have access to them without much concern on our parts. But for many reasons, we ought to be concerned with at least some of those entities and states of the world today which, in light of their having one or other kind of value, are candidates for bequeathal. It is maybe unrealistic that we could bequeath all of them, for instance, because we've already gone so far in destroying them, or because we are well entitled to impart some wear upon the earth as others have done before us. If this idea can be granted, one sees where it leads in terms of the idea of a bequest package. What should we fill up the basket with for the future? What makes it a good basket, an equitable basket? The second aspect, or evaluative aspect of bequeathal, what I'm calling evaluative integration, concerns something quite complex, but it's also quite subtle about bequeathal. The general idea is that there needs to be evaluative coordination or alignment between the cohort that bequeaths and the cohort that enjoys that bequeathal. This does not at all go without saying, and yet is an easily missed aspect of bequeathal as future-directed action. This is so for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the value of some of the things in our bequest package might not unreasonably be taken to speak for themselves. Perhaps this is the case for the pyramids of Giza or the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. Now, between ourselves and the next generation, there is no need for explicit evaluative integration because the value of the Garden of Earthly Delights speaks for itself. Its value is somehow self-teaching. Second, for so-called near-generation bequeathal, evaluative integration may already be implicitly at work. Certain old fogies among us may disagree with the TikTokers and the Twitch streamers on the value of many things, but there's a lot that's implicitly shared as well. Our parents built the internet and we expanded it, and our near descendants can likewise grasp its value under some form at least. With these considerations in place, we can think about how high-level nuclear waste changes the question of about how to act towards the future, at least when it's framed in terms of bequeathal. First, in terms of electivity, unlike the other ways in which bequeathal questions might be addressed, whether we should save paintings by Bosch or Frida Kahlo, whether we should save paintings by Kahlo or orchids, whether we should save orchids or whales. In the case of high-level nuclear waste, we seem unable to arrest our passing on of that waste to the future, and indeed to very remote futures at that. In other words, with high-level nuclear waste, the question is no longer how should we properly bequeath some X so that it and its value are preserved for the future. Instead, the bequeathal question of high-level nuclear waste has to be framed differently. How should we properly bequeath this waste so that the future will be spared its inalterable disvalue to the greatest extent possible? I want to pause here for a moment because I really want to highlight the significance of our lack of electivity with respect to high-level nuclear waste. And so here I should like to note that there are all kinds of things that we are leaving behind for future generations about which, on the one hand, we may seem to have little choice, but on the other hand, instantiate a kind of disvalue or serious disvalue. We human beings go about breaking things all the time. We have accidents. We wear out the world for reasons good or bad in all different sorts of ways. Yet for many cases of such wear, breakage, or damage of parts of our world, these X's I'm talking about to be bequeathed, there may be a way of including something in our bequest package which can make up for those bad things. Optimistically, at least, if you're an optimist like me, we can compensate for our ineptitudes and other faults. This is where having a ladder of values can be quite helpful in considering what to include in our bequest package. Yet with respect to high-level nuclear waste, I'd warrant that it is very difficult, nigh impossible, to consider what we might best include in any bequest package so that on the balance, that package will still be seen to be as equitable towards the future. Our lack of electivity regarding high-level nuclear waste seems drastic because it's very hard to think of something on the ladder of values that could make up for it. If this is also the case for other kinds of so-called epic waste like PFAS, microplastics, it seems to me particularly true for high-level nuclear waste. That waste represents a kind of meltdown within our bequest package, a kind of gaping, spreading tear in whatever basket we might otherwise so conscientiously be filling for our futures. Turning now to the second evaluative aspect of bequeathal, one might say that the future does not form a kind of threat to high-level nuclear waste or to its disvalue, unlike other cases of bequeathal that I've highlighted. With high-level nuclear waste, the opposite seems to be the case, in that the waste can be reasonably understood as a threat to the future. Still, regarding that waste, something that is under threat from the future is its evaluative integration for and by the future recipients of our bequeathing. The very process of the handing over the waste to the future may require an evaluative alignment that is different from and more challenging than the one that is involved in other forms of intergenerational bequeathal. This is because the reasons for which we are bequeathing high-level nuclear waste to the future may, for those futures, be quite remote indeed. I say this not simply because they might ask themselves why we would bequeath to them something of this value, like nuclear waste, in the first place. Rather, I'm claiming this because evaluative integration between communities now and in the future, and also between discrete futures themselves, coordinations between their and our ladders of values, may be subject to various discontinuities and misalignments. The more remotely such coordinations might be called for. Evaluative coordinations are already far from a foregone conclusion in our own world, even amongst humans living today. Consider here, for instance, the question of what counts in different communities today as a danger, as opposed to being a mere manifestation of environmental adversity. the latter just being a way that the world resists one or some of our projects or ways of life. And consider again, in diverse communities, what counts as a greater or lesser danger, and what are the greatest dangers to be encountered in our worlds. Continuing the premise behind these questions, it is not inconceivable that future recipients of our bequeathal may arrive at answers to those questions that are very different from our own. What complicates this preliminary consideration of our bequeathing to the future is that high-level nuclear waste is not just a material or a thing. It is something that gives rise to a situation, as strange as that might sound to you. About such waste, we cannot simply ask, as we might ask about the knife or the flask of pesticide, where do we put it? Do we put it in this drawer or that? One way of understanding the situation that high-level nuclear waste provokes is in terms of how it seems prone to a kind of oblivion or forgetting. This makes ethical action with regard to it a far murkier proposition. This propensity towards oblivion stems in part from the material properties of the waste which make it so deadly. Unlike most material conditions for disvaluable entities, states of affairs, and events that come and go, the lethal, emissive, and contaminative qualities of the waste hardly curtail over vast expanses of time. Yet at the same time, these qualities are hardly phenomenologically accessible. This combination of properties of the waste makes it so that its lethal properties are hardly knowable via direct experience. And yet any evaluative knowledge of it gained by other means, inductive, scientific, or whatnot, is under threat. The lifespan of those lethal properties appears able to outstrip the persistence of evaluative knowledge about it, threatening discontinuity in the memory of the waste and its extensive capacity to do harm. However, this propensity towards oblivion, a kind of being towards forgetting of the waste, is one that we humans today very much have a hand in our de facto handling of this waste. We, through our institutions, seem committed to its concealment via its burial. Where this is planned or where this is occurring, such burial may not be entirely unreasonable, at least depending on who one asks. In light of the properties of the waste, it is, more than any other form of waste we humans have ever produced, a material for which it is hugely difficult to find a suitable waste place within our life worlds. That is to say, a locus or lodging for it, facultative of its evaluative marginalization. But such concealment also heightens the risks, once more, of its forgetting, and thus also the risks of its forgotten burial. For instance, the long-term and potentially irreparable contamination of groundwater and soil. In the taking hold of the oblivion of high-level nuclear waste would thus be constituted a strange situation for our passing it on to the future. Its only trace may be the mysterious death and desolation that now one future form of life, now another, may attribute to the sky, the water, the earth, the sun, or whatever strikes them as being the best candidate to allocate the sources of such danger. We think there is an apt term for describing the situation with regard to high-level nuclear waste. It is an emergency. Describing it thus is helpful for dealing with a very, very tricky but fascinating meta-ethical question that arises in cases of bequeathing high-level nuclear waste to the future. Namely, in what is ethical responsibility for appropriate bequeathal grounded? How should some sense of the good to be served through our bequeathing action be grounded? And indeed, how is it to be grounded both for ourselves and for far remote futures? I'm making things quite complicated here. So here I'm adverting to a critical facet of the situation of such waste, which may not be very apparent to you. The kind of action we take towards such waste must not simply have a future, that is to say, one future generation as its target. Rather, many futures may be affected by its bequeathal And between those futures, there may also be oblivion and forgetting, the degradation of the possibility of evaluative integration, and thereby the degradation of the quality of its bequeathal. In our action towards future generations, therefore, in order for that action to be adequate to the task of properly bequeathing the waste, we must thus enlist future generations in order to seek their participation taking up the task of bequeathing the waste. Our bequeathal must become theirs. Perhaps they will reject or fail to recognize such an appeal for their participation, but for our bequeathal to be as effective as possible, our responsibility must, in some sense, become theirs. If this is correct, then also whatever grounds our responsibility must, in some sense, ground their responsibility. Now, there are a lot of neat things that would be worth discussing here, but let me furnish you with a rough sense of the problem of grounding ethical responsibility to bequeath appropriately. Perhaps some of you here, I'd warrant, would reject outright the notion that there's anything like a transcendental eternal good. So be it, and yet some of those same persons here might well be interested in acting ethically, appropriately towards far distant future forms of life, ones that might not even be human. The good you serve in such action must, in some sense, be their good. Yet what is that? Might it not seem like the height of human or philosophical hubris to imagine that we might know what is good for those futures, and that that is what we serve through our actions today? It seems here that in entertaining such a question, ethical actions towards far remote future forms of life, one might be coming very close to positing something like a transcendental good. The appeal to the idea of emergencies as defining the situation in which action towards high-level nuclear waste ought to be taken, as grounding that responsibility, is part of an effort on our parts to deflate some of the difficulties that I've just been alluding to. The idea is that without prejudice to the Platonists or the anti-Platonists among you, some aspects of the good are more noble or more easily shared in deep time than others. Perhaps, indeed, we can't know what one or some futures will conceive of as justice or dignity in some thick sense, but the thought here is that other kinds of evaluative understandings, such as threats and harms to life, may well be shared across vast generations and between vastly different configurations and conceptions of the good life. Yet something here that may not be so clear is how to understand how the situations created by high-level nuclear waste now and into the future are to be understood as emergencies. Emergencies may seem to you like situations which do in fact ground some kinds of responsibilities or a sense of the good for forms of life, but then it might seem to you unclear how to understand how the situation arising from high-level nuclear waste could count as such. The challenge seems all the more acute once we start to specify some characteristics of an emergency. Emergencies involve a dynamic danger configuration that, at its extreme, forecloses the possibility of action and intervention. Yet that implies that emergencies are defined by spatial and temporal relativity. My drowning in the Meuse or the Yakagani is not an emergency for somebody in Singapore, nor for someone who shall live in Cologne 20 years from now. Moreover, unlike mere dangers, emergencies seem to be defined by an exigency to act. This exigency is often understood in terms of the previous feature. When emergencies come to be weighed against each other, their exigency may be taken not solely as a function of the harm threatened in the emergency, but also as a function of the temporally constrained availability of intervention in the emergency situation. What I'm saying to you is that these features of emergencies seem to contrast sharply with the situation of bequeathing high-level nuclear waste to the future. However, what I want to try to convince you is that those apparent dissimilarities do not disqualify the premise that high-level nuclear waste does in fact constitute a kind of emergency. The qualification needed here is that our leaving behind high-level nuclear waste for the future is a kind of special emergency. and therefore unlike those other kinds of emergency encountered regrettably in our mundane lives. The groundwork for clarifying what is special about emergencies of high-level nuclear waste can be drawn from the concepts of slow violence and slow disaster developed by Rachel Carson and Rob Dixon, where they are concerned with understanding how environmental harm can come about not only suddenly, not only cataclysmically, but also insidiously, as a slow-building calamity lurking in waiting. The idea of slow disaster coheres well with the way there is an epic, unfathomable temporality to the future existence of high-level nuclear waste. As unimaginable as that future course of the existence of the waste is, we do know that it will extend so long as to make ineliminable some minimal risk of interaction of a form of life with it, if and when those forms of life do exist, and therefore some minimal risk of dire, irreversible effects of the waste on its surrounding environs. The risk or probability there hardly seems able to be zero. Yet whatever it might be, it also seems unknowable to us today. This risk of interaction with the waste is obviously ineliminable for so-called zones of exclusion like Hanford, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Islands. Yet even when the waste would be buried, that is to say in Norway, Finland, or Belgium, it also seems ineliminable for a number of reasons. There is uncertainty about how, in the long term, the waste will interact with the materials in which it is stored or with materials of its surrounding burial site. There's uncertainty about whether the sites selected will remain as geologically stable in the future as they have now. There is uncertainty about whether the waste will in some way be disturbed by some form of life. This facet of the situation created by high-level nuclear waste accounts, in our view, or in my view at least, for the special sense in which we can speak of it as a certain, albeit slow, emergency. Comparing situations of bequeathing high-level nuclear waste to slow disasters helps clarify why they are special emergencies. But there is another feature of them that makes them a special but not unique emergency. They are also special due to an entirely different class of quote-unquote agents of concern that they involve as compared to other kinds of emergencies. By agents of concerns in emergencies are meant those persons or entities that should be appropriately motivated to act in emergencies. This notion is an analog of the agents we tend to hold morally accountable as worthy of praise or blame in view of their action or inaction in emergencies. Think of the good and bad Samaritans so often discussed in duty to rescue discussions. In other words, agents of concern are those entities to whom there devolves a responsibility to act issued by the exigency of the emergency. The delineation of who precisely is and is not an agent of concern typically draws on several factors, for instance, having to do with those persons in closest proximity to the emergency, the passers-by when one is swimming in the Rhine, lingus in the forest, but it also has to do with the competences of those with the capability to intervene on the behalf of the entities affected by the emergency. Our bequeathal of high-level nuclear waste can have no such individual agents of concern in this mundane sense. No passers-by in Britannia or Lithuania can be held accountable for their inaction towards the waste. It would be mistaken, though, to think that emergencies of high-level nuclear waste have no agents of concern whatsoever. Rather, while they are certainly situations that at least I think should concern persons living today, in a strange sense, no individual persons now or in the future are the agents of concern involved in those emergencies. From the point of view of the obligations that devolve from and the actionability disposed of in emergencies, they have to be seen as emergencies for collective agents of concern. Only collectives, that is to say, certain groups or institutions and their representative powers, can take action, direct or indirect, towards the waste in situation, And only inasmuch as persons living today and tomorrow are the makeup of such collectives, are they to be thought to be submitted to the exigency of such action. Similar to the situation we face with climate change, it seems unnecessarily astringent to claim that because there is no temporal or spatial relativity as pertains to individuals in the one case or the other, each cannot count as an emergency. They are both emergencies for humanity, but only certain collectives dispose of agency with regard to them. This facet of high-level nuclear waste and its emergency does not lessen the responsibility that we have with regard to it, but it demands a shift in our understanding of its nature. In taking high-level nuclear waste, so let me sum up a little bit here before I do my last part. In taking high-level nuclear waste to foment special cases of emergency, the idea is that in them, a call to ethical action is grounded, now and deep into the future. This they would share with other kinds of emergencies with which we might be familiar, and yet they are unlike them at the same time. In some key ways, they are unlike the burning cigarettes in the olive grove, referring to Lingus again, threatening a fire and destruction of both natural and cultural heritage, and they are also unlike the situation where a person is at risk of drowning. First, they have a very peculiar kind of localization. The waste, luckily enough for us, is not everywhere. It's not here. It is situated only at certain sites around the Earth, yet its lethality is of such a strength that it does not only threaten some locals. In a way, it threatens all of us. An interference with the waste could have wide-ranging harmful effects beyond the forms of life living in proximity to it. A second peculiarity about this emergency is its actionability. Unlike a lifeline thrown into the water for somebody, it is not an emergency that any individual or even just any group can act upon. It's something that only certain collectives can act upon. And third, there is its peculiar temporality, which I've been highlighting time and again. A temporality that, barring some miraculous technological intervention, entails that the lethal material properties of high-level nuclear waste will subsist far beyond any continuous experiential capacities to recognize or act upon their dangers. In other words, it is an emergency whose defining characteristic is a form of radical discontinuity in terms of which some forms of life are likely to encounter it. Thus, via our ethical action, not only must the emergency that is created by the nuclear waste be mitigated, but also the radical discontinuity in which that emergency may be encountered must also somehow be mitigated. Okay, so if these considerations justify to some extent why our bequeathal of high-level nuclear waste constitutes a special emergency, there still remains the problem of appropriate action in the face of it. What is the appropriate way, the good way, the right way in which to bequeath such a special emergency? How are enduring emergencies to be bequeathed more generally? And how can different philosophies and different philosophers meaningfully intervene in such questions? For instance, in the case of long-term special emergencies, should we model such bequeathal on Rawlsian proxy consent, as Kristen Schrader-Frechette, perhaps the preeminent and first philosopher of nuclear waste, would suggest? As difficult as these questions may seem, I want to share with you, on the part, hopefully, of the we, that is Nicolas and I, a few thoughts about the shape that some action must take. The basic proposal, which certainly is not about solving the problem of the waste or solving the storage of the waste, is that we cannot simply bequeath such an emergency. The issue here is not simply metaphysical in the sense that one might wonder whether a situation like an emergency can be given or passed on in a manner that some resources, or a painting, or a gold watch, might be passed on to others. Rather, the issue is that the emergency of the waste, which we cannot but pass on, must itself be passed on by the future to whom we bequeath it. In this sense, the future must not only take care of themselves with respect to the dangers of the waste, they must also take care of the emergency of the waste for their own future. The future must be entreated to participate with us in care for the emergency of the waste if our bequeathal of it is to have maximal ethical effect. Our notion for this is entrustment. Now again, there would be a lot to be said about this notion, such as how it might or might not capture the idea of evaluative integration and bequeathal, but let me, in concluding, sketch a few of its aspects. You and I may have been party to different kinds of entrustments, more or less explicit, and may have also entrusted certain kinds of X's to others. Yet the kind of entrustment as called for by the emergency of the nuclear waste may seem unlike what we might be familiar with. In the first place, and I've been emphasizing this already, it would always have to be a partial or incomplete entrustment. Even while each recipient of the entrustment would have to take responsibility over the emergency and its care, there would be no one future generation to whom the emergency would be entrusted once and for all. Second of all, it would have to be a quite explicit, manifest type of entrustment, one robust enough to resist the withering sands of time tied to the history of the nuclear waste down through the eons. And at the same time, it would have to be a disembodied, distant type of entrustment or entreaty. In contrast to how, in a dire emergency, one might entrust a loved one to someone else, the entrustment of the waste could not rely on the white of our eyes, the bulge of our veins, the tightness of our voice, to communicate our deep concern for the futures, nor could it rely on the warmth of our touch or our gaze to communicate our trust in the futures, that they will take care of the emergency. Third and last of all, it would have to be, on our thinking at least, a form of entrustment that could potentially be quite destabilizing or disruptive for its recipients. If, for instance, our appeal for care for the waste were for a time forgotten and then rediscovered, such an appeal might simply be ignored, as we ourselves tend to ignore our ancestors. Yet even where our appeal might be attended to, and where some minimal evaluative integration between ourselves in the future might take hold, our gift of evaluative knowledge of the waste might sow discord for its recipients, inasmuch as it might not cohere with their ladder of values. The manner in which they experience the world as an evaluative landscape in which dangers, adversities, and potential emergencies are distributed. In this sense, there might always be something very risky, if not nefarious, about our action towards the future as entrustment, the more maximally ethically effective we might aim for it to be. Thank you very much.